Well, thanks. It's great to be here this morning and to be in Sydney. And it's interesting that it does seem to be a city very sensitive to water issues, as I see on the front page of the paper today, but perhaps not quite the water issues that we want to deal with. I've been asked to talk about what it takes politically to sell the big ideas that challenge the status quo. And I do that obviously with my background as a former water minister and politician, but also the work we've been doing in our A3.3 project on influencing politics. But in preparing for today, I did speak to a former political and media advisor from government who's actually done some work for the CRC, and I told her I was giving this talk and asked her what does she think it takes politically to sell the big ideas. And she said, well, get into government and get a bucket of money and advertise. Now, you know, that sounds sort of facetious, but it actually does reflect a fair bit of experience. And while most of us here aren't going to be getting into government or into politics, and you're certainly not on the sort of salaries that are going to allow you to advertise what you're doing, I think there are some basic lessons that we can learn that can help us to influence the political process a lot more successfully. And that's what I want to talk about. And if we're going to do that, what we have to do is understand politics and understand your target politician. Just like David Attenborough looks closely at nature, we've got to look closely at politicians and politics, even if it's a bit ugly at times. Now, I think just to conceptualise the political arena to start with, and there is a paper that we've come across in our research project that was actually written by a former politician from Norway, Christine Meyer, and what she talks about, and it's quite a good way of thinking about politics, is the two arenas. There's that orange area, the broad external political arena, where you've got the public, the media, the lobby groups, the stakeholders, the whole political debate. But then there's that green area, which is behind the closed doors. And that's the bureaucrats, the politicians, the influential advisors and stakeholders. And she talks about a policy subsystem which generally is in that internal area but goes to a degree to the external area, which is a particular area of policy which includes experts and relationships and a culture. And in a sense that's where we are. That's this group. We're a policy subsystem. We're largely within that internal space, so local government, water authorities, government people, universities, but to a degree we go out into the external political arena. And the key insight she had is that if you're going to influence what happens in the internal area, you need also to influence the external area. That is how the public think, what the media are doing, what lobby groups are doing, have a big influence on what happens inside. And you've got to think about that relationship. But what she doesn't have, and I think we also need to understand from my experience, is another group, which is the superpower group. This group it's the Premier, the Minister, the Treasurer, maybe one or two other extremely powerful people who really have the power to say yay or nay, that they can accept or reject a major policy reform, and all the work that's done in the external political arena and the internal area can be upset by that. And I think we have to understand that. The other group you'll see I've referred to up there are policy entrepreneurs, and I think they're really important. Policy entrepreneurs are people who are prepared to take risks. They're people who are innovators in policy. They can be in the internal section or they can be in the external arena. And I think part of the success of this whole project has been that the Water Sensitive Cities group has some pretty good policy entrepreneurs. I think Tony and Rebecca are two classic examples who've been prepared to take risks just like a business entrepreneur. Now, generally, what are the factors that make it more difficult to achieve change, political change? And this is for all major changes. First, of course, the size of the change, how complex it is, the level of community support, and very importantly, vested interests. Who are your powerful supporters and opponents who have a vested interest in this topic? Now, if you look at the great challenge we've had as a country to tackle a difficult, complex issue of climate change, overwhelmingly the reason we're not getting anywhere is the power of vested interests. If you look at public views, 70% of people think, yeah, we should be doing stuff, but there are very strong and vested interests against that, and that's really why that's been difficult to proceed. The next group that's important, and it's part of that internal part of the circle I put to a large degree, is elite opinion. Elite opinion in Australia, as in most of the world, is very powerful. It's not always clear exactly who it is, but in Australia, the elites, Treasury, leading economists, leading business people, and their key power is that they're the people who have the power to, or have the telephone number of the people in that red bit in the middle. They can get a phone call through to Tony Abbott. And, I've heard of people now, they talk about, oh, this person's got Tony Abbott on speed dial. And this is the elites. Now, interestingly, probably the biggest and toughest political reform of the last 40 or 50 years in Australia was the financial and economic reforms of the Hawke-Keating government. And they were hard, but what they had was the elite behind them. And that's why a Labor Party was able to do that. Other factors are the media, the opposition, and what's the parliamentary stance? Is it a government that's on a knife edge, or is it a government with a big majority? Now, with all of that, thinking of those two circles, the inner and the outer, what I would be saying to you today is, I'll just quickly look at the challenges we face in terms of water-sensitive cities, the political challenges. The first challenge we've got is the perception that the water problem is fixed. We've had rain. Affordability, why spend so soon after desal? Water-sensitive cities aren't well understood. Getting water on the government priority list is a big challenge. We've got to get other ministers involved. I think probably the biggest political challenge for this whole issue is that it challenges the centralised management of utilities, which has been our traditional way of doing things. And that's partly about vested interests, but it's also partly about how do you govern a system we're talking about, which has a very distributed approach to management. We're also in this area talking about long-term benefits, but there are short-term costs, and the key question is who pays for public benefit? So we've got quite a few challenges as we sell our idea. But I think the key is now's the time to start, because this is a long-term project that's going to take many years, and we've got to get moving. Now, given, as I said, that internal and external approach and the impact of what the public and the media and stakeholders have on political success, and the importance of those powerful people in the middle, what we need is two strategies if we're going to sell this dream. We need a political strategy and we need a community strategy. And between those two strategies, there are attitudes and behaviours that flow both ways. Attitudes influence behaviours and behaviours influence attitudes. But we've got to do both. So talking first about the political strategy. If we're going to have that, we've got to understand politics. And the first most absolutely critical understanding is that power is very centralised at the top in our political system. And the second point you've got to understand is the intense time pressure that leading politicians are under. And the example I give, you compare it to historic times where the Prime Minister of Australia and early Prime Minister Fisher actually went on a boat to the United Kingdom for 3 months while he was Prime Minister. Compare that to the current Prime Minister or the previous Prime Minister who are probably working 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. I think there was a period where Julia Gillard did not have a day off for 3 months. Incredibly busy. Politics is continual conflict, very adversarial. There's 24-hour media power. Many stakeholders have expectations. It's very complex. Market economics and treasury dominate political decision-making. And the consequence of that is you've got to understand you are not the only priority. And if there's one thing, when I hear scientists and others trying to influence the process, I'd almost feel like saying, yes, but you've got to understand you're just one of 30 or 40 people trying to get your point across. And the other consequence of all of this is the importance of the trusted advisor. Because things are so complex, so busy, so adversarial, politicians, senior politicians rely hugely on a few trusted advisors. Now, what does drive a minister? And this reflects certainly what drove me and I think drives most ministers. First, their personal values and beliefs. Now, what do they believe should happen? And associated with that is their personal psychology and emotions. As we go around Australia talking to different ministers, we've got to understand they're different. They've got different psychologies, different types of emotions, and you've got to approach them in different ways. But also we have to take into account the values and beliefs of their political party. And in this area, environment, water-sensitive cities, clearly there are different values. The next point is related back to what I said about busyness. Ministers have limited time. They've got lots of stimuli, and that means they have to prioritise and they take mental shortcuts. And I can tell you the strongest mental shortcut you have as a minister is, who is the person who's talking to me and do I trust them? Absolutely. If it's someone that you don't know, you might take the advice of the department. If it's someone you know and trust, you are very likely to take their advice. Now, what's the implication of that? The implication is you need to build up long-term trusting relations with those very powerful people. Obviously, as a minister, you do want to deliver good policies and you probably want to get re-elected next time. So that then leads to what I normally would say are the 10 commandments of influencing government, but I'm only going to give you 8 today because I want to cut the time down. I should say that once when I was an opposition spokesperson, I went out with a 10-point ambulance plan, and as I was walking out to the media conference, my media advisor said, we've only got 9 points, and the heading said 10-point ambulance plan. So we postponed the press conference and added another point. But these are my 8 points I want to raise today. First, and critically, know what you want to achieve and be clear about it. Make it easy to adopt. And this is an area I would be critical of our group to date. Don't think that the politicians and the senior bureaucrats have the time or the inclination to take your research and fashion it into a policy. You've got to hand it to them on a plate. Make it absolutely crystal clear what you want them to do. Second, know what the government wants to achieve and make sure you fit into that. You're consistent with that. And it sounds obvious, but so many groups don't do that. What is it that the government wants to do that you can fulfil? Third, once again critical, identify who has the power to make the decision. It may not be the minister. In many of these things, it'll be someone else, so find out who it is and target that person. What will influence him or her or that grouping? Fourth, collaborate. Come as a team. If you can bring business with you and the local council and some other influential group, you're going to be much more powerful than if it's just yourselves. Now, one thing I'll refer a bit more later is obviously in the health area. Nigel and others are doing some, absolutely fantastic leading work there. But go with the health people. Go with the other people that are going to have real clout in government when you're selling your idea. Fifth, understand the power of values and emotion. For scientists, this is one of them, and academics, this is one of the most difficult because they are so wedded to the facts and the evidence and the research. Emotion wins every time. There's plenty of research to show that in politics. It's not the facts, you've got to have the facts, but it's the emotion, it's the values that win the political debates. Put real effort into communication. Make what you're doing interesting. Make it exciting, new, innovative in communication. And when you're doing your communicating, send in your best players. Now, some people are more convincing than others. Use them. Be persistent. Politics is it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so if you're persistent, you're more likely to be successful. And finally, timing. Timing in politics is everything. There are so many things happening, you're not necessarily going to get your thing up at a particular time, but wait. Wait for the right time and then seize that opportunity. I think an outstanding example of a scientist who did influence government was Peter Cullen. I mean, you look at probably one of the greatest reforms we've seen in the country in the last 20 or 30 years was the Murray-Darling Basin. It's quite extraordinary to think of the changes to that. To think that 3,000 gigalitres of water now has been taken out of irrigation to put back into the environment. 10 years ago when I was minister, we thought 1,200 would be the absolute maximum that could be agreed. Even the environment groups were pushing to get 1,500, double that. Now, Peter Cullen and the Wentworth Group were very influential in achieving that. And they did it through good science, they built a collaboration, they worked with government, they were very courteous and credible. One of the outstanding factors of Peter Cullen was the use of language. He was master of the metaphor and he understood government and he seized the opportunity. And the opportunity was John Howard wanting to be seen to do something at that time on the environment. So what does this all mean for us? What we have to do is look, well, what are the key aspects of water-sensitive cities? The diverse water supply, green infrastructure, governance. Then we have to say, well, what do we want? Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of that now, but what we do have to do as a collective organisation is identify, reform of economic regulation, reform of legislation, funding, governance reform, community participation. We've got to identify that very clearly and identify what are the policy outcomes we want, and then we have to say, well, who's got the power to implement those things? So we need a mapping process, and it's going to look a lot more detailed than that, but if we're going to influence politics, we're going to have to do that work. So that's the first thing, that's the political strategy. The other side of the coin is the community strategy, and there are three aspects of that. First, it's community engagement. And we have to not just tell the community what we're doing, we have to engage them. And I'd say that this group has been pretty good at that. The whole process, the transitions management process, the work that Rebecca and others have done, I think is starting to bear fruit. The second is behaviour change. And I'm not going to go into detail on this, but Liam Smith and his group are obviously doing research in this area, but I think the key understanding from this area, in my experience, is that change in behaviour can change attitudes. And we saw that in Victoria when we had our major water conservation campaign, that as people changed their behaviour to conserve water, their attitude to water and the politics of water changed. But the third thing we need to do, and I do want to talk a little bit about this today because I think it's critical and we're not doing as much as we could, is media and media strategy. And why do we need a media strategy? It's because going back to that circle within a circle, The inner circle, the powerful people, the internal people are very influenced by what is in the media. That is going to be a key factor that drives all those people in the circle, including the superpower people. In fact, that's probably the only way they'll ever think about water-sensitive cities, the Premier and the Treasurer. Has it been in the media, and what did the media say about it? And as we do the media, can I urge you to think about the power of language? You know, if there's one thing I'm critical of academics about, it is very often the language is full of jargon, and it's opaque, it's not clear. And I know all groups use their own forms of language, but if you want to communicate with politicians, you need to use clear, interesting, powerful language. And I emphasise the power of the metaphor. I mean, Keating with the Banana Republic was able to put in one metaphor the whole reason we had to act on the economy, because if we didn't, we'd end up as a banana republic, and that cut through. Lincoln, the great user of the metaphor in politics. And Bob Brown, there's a quote he used there in the Franklin Dam dispute: flooding the Franklin would be like putting a scratch across the Mona Lisa. And that was in the press. People understand that's what it means. And linked to that is how you frame issues. Now, framing means what's the mental picture you get when you say the word. Now, how did the Rudd government frame their carbon legislation, their climate action? They called it the CPRS. Now, what the hell is the CPRS? What did Abbott do? He called it the great big new tax. Immediately, everyone understood it. And so, you know, compare that, and what do we talk about? Integrated water cycle management, WOWCM. What's the frame? What's it mean? So I think thinking about metaphor. Now, the one metaphor we've used is green infrastructure, which I think is a good start. That gives people an idea of what it is, but I think we have to put more effort into our language. What the media likes, they're not that interested in policy. They want human drama. They want pictures, and they want conflict and lists. That's what they love. What makes news? Something with impact. Does it affect most people? Timeliness. Does it fit in with a hot issue? Is it a new piece of information? Is it novel? Is there a conflict involved? Is there human interest? And if it bleeds, it leads. That's the first, you know, and you know, why is the first item on the Channel 10 news almost always an ambulance story? Because it's bleeding, it's leading. And if you're thinking, and we're thinking of how to write like a reporter, you need to think of that inverse pyramid news formula: who, what, where, when, why, and how. You need a snappy introduction. Think in headlines, pictures and graphics. Nail a good grab and keep the language real, you know, not academic jargon. Now, over summer, the CRC and Nigel and Margaret Loughnan were very successful in getting stories up about their research. Front page in the Adelaide Advertiser, and what the story was: what are the city's most vulnerable suburbs to heat wave? And we had a list of suburbs. And of course everyone loves that, because they can check, is their suburb in it? You know, if you talk about the theoretical suburb, the urban area, you know, people aren't interested in that. They want to know what their suburb's like. Where do they rate? So as much as possible, we want to turn our research into something that impacts people where they live. How does this affect me? Where do I rate compared to others? And this is back from when I was minister. You know, front page in the papers again. We had the suburbs, the best and the worst water saver suburbs. Front page. But also water bans permanent, controversy, you know, a bit of a hard edge and conflict. And we're seeing now in Victoria, unfortunately, the media getting on top into a lot of stories about the Office of Living Victoria. You know, very much why are they interested so much? It's about controversy and conflict. So I'm not saying that's how we've got to get water in the media, But I am saying we've got to understand that's how the media operates. And finally, when I was minister between 2002 and 2010, we ran a major water campaign. It did involve the media, but down the bottom you'll see social marketing, advertising, talking to the public was a key part of it. So in conclusion, what we need is a political strategy and a community strategy. We need to work out what you want and who has the power to deliver it. We need to understand the framework of government. How are they operating? What's their psychology? What are their values? What are their priorities? We need to understand that facts are not enough. Values and emotions are critical. Battles are never won. This is an ongoing challenge. We've got to keep going ourselves. Communication and the power of language, and use the media. Thank you.